Welcome to another episode of Therapy with Josh D. I'm Josh Davis, a licensed mental health counselor here in South Florida, helping people connect and navigate relationship trauma. Today we are talking about all things complex trauma and EMDR with my good friend and a wonderful therapist, Leah Gooley. I hope this is helpful for you guys to understand what complex trauma is, how it impacts our relationships, and also a little bit about EMDR. It may be something that you guys are interested in as another therapeutic approach. So hang on tight. This is a great conversation. Here we go. Hi,
Hello.
good morning.
Good morning. I'm sorry. I'm stuffing my face right before my session real long.
No, that's fine. Eat. That's totally fine. Do what you gotta do.
I just get low blood sugar. And get
It happens.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Good.
Really good.
It's so nice to see you. It feels like it's been a while.
I know. It really has.
Yeah. I was talking to my husband because I told him I was recording today, and I was like, "Oh, it's Leah," and he's like, "Who's that?" And I was like, "I really just met her, but I feel like we've known each other forever. Like, I don't know why if you feel that way, but I feel like
I do.
we've been friends for like the longest time, which I really
I said that to my husband and my sister-in-law this morning. I was like, it's so fun to meet someone that you're like, oh, I've only met you a couple times, but I feel like you've been like my BFF for like a decade.
I know. I know. It's nice when you vibe with someone. It's great.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to get started?
Sure.
Cool.
Let's do it.
Tell me about yourself. Who are you? How'd you get into therapy? All that good stuff.
Yeah. So my name's Leah Gooley. I've been in private practice for about 6 years. I found out that I was pregnant the same week that I opened my private practice. So when I think about how long I've been practiced, I think about how old my son is.
That's a big
um,
week.
it was a pretty wild experience to have that happen at the same time. Really exciting, but
Yeah, lots
wild.
of exciting stuff, but all at the same time. I'm sure that was like super overwhelming.
Yes, definitely. So
Yeah.
I've been in the field for over a decade. I've kind of worked in a bunch of different environments from like I did all of my foundational training at a trauma-informed treatment center for teenage girls. Loved that experience. And from there, I've kind of worked with little kids. I've worked with geriatric adults. I've worked in a school setting. I've worked with teenagers. And now I really mostly work with adults kind of across the spectrum. Um, and really enjoy it. I've come from a long line of helpers, and so either special ed teachers, social workers, just the traditional helping field. So that's kind of always something that my parents thought that I would go into. They thought that I'd probably more go into like the education realm of things.
Okay.
But I think that helping others has been something that was a big part of our family culture and values, and I really love what I get to do.
Yeah, that's great. And now you specialize just in trauma, right? That's kind of your bread and butter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And so,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask you, can I ask about your relationship?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm always curious about people's like connection and like how they met their partner and like it's not I think you guys have been married for a while.
Yeah, it's going to be 11 years. So we've
11
been together
years.
for 13. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Congratulations, you guys. That's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Can I
Yeah,
ask
it's really
like how'd you
fun.
guys meet? Like how was that for you guys?
Yeah, we actually met, my brother had known him. They had kind of the same mentor growing up. My brother moved here to the Palm Beach area for college, and his mentor, who was also his lacrosse coach, was the person who mentored my husband growing up. And so they met that way. And that's sort of how we met too. My husband doesn't remember the first time we meet, so I like to give him a hard time about it. Because
You don't remember me?
yeah, he doesn't
How dare
remember,
you?
but he had a lot going on, and so I like
Yeah.
to give him a
Yeah.
hard time about it. But yeah.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Well, I know that you specialize in EMDR. So tell if no one knows what EMDR is, like what's kind of the pitch? What is
Yeah.
EMDR? What is it good
So
for? Like what it maybe not so good for? Like walk me through it.
So yes, with EMDR, it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And that's just a big, long, fancy word for the way that our trauma gets stuck in our brain when we've experienced something that felt unsafe, that kind of rewires the way that we look at the world. So it's taking bilateral stimulation. So it could be with a lot of clients will self tap like a butterfly tap,
Mm-hmm.
or we use these tappers or eye movements by following a light. And it's taking a memory that feels still visceral, something that happened in the past, but still feels very present because our brain is doing what it's supposed to of alerting us to danger. And so we're like, hey, that thing that happened, let's make sure that never happens again because of this particular way that it made us feel about ourselves and our place in the world. So it takes a traumatic memory and a negative belief about ourselves, and it reprocesses it all. It's kind of like organizing a messy closet. It puts everything in exactly where it needs to go.
Mm-hmm.
And by using that the bilateral stimulation, it reorganizes things. So it puts it in the file folder that it's supposed to be. And so it replaces that negative belief into a more positive and adaptive belief. And the way that it does that, the reason why bilateral stimulation is important is because it's stimulating the two different hemispheres of the brain. That's similar to REM sleep. And if REM sleep is where we dream, but it's also how we reprocess and recharge and understand the things that have happened in our day. It taps into that same sort of neurological component so that it makes sure that our head and our heart and the way that it's stored in our body is all on the same page. So I like to say kind of that if we know something to be true, but it still feels differently, that tension, that's where EMDR can really come in so that everything is on the same page.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting because I say the same thing about NARM, where someone will know something, but they won't know it in their heart or in their body. It's a way of integrating. And it's interesting that you're talking about EMDR because I never thought about it as a somatic modality, but it makes so much sense of how it's kind of reorienting it, putting it back in your body in the way that it's able to be tolerated. And I'm curious to know
Yeah.
your thoughts about what do you, because I know in EMDR there's little T's and big T's, and I know that that's little traumas and big traumas, and I'm curious from your perspective and from EMDR's perspective, what would consider what would trauma be considered as, and then what's the kind of difference between the little T's and the big T's?
Yeah. And so trauma, I think it can be very subjective, right? Because what could be traumatic to one person, another person might not blink at. And so it's really a personal experience. But I think it's anything where you felt so unsafe enough
Hmm.
that it rewires the way that you feel about yourself in the world. And a lot of times it's this feeling of aloneness. I felt alone in this place. I felt helpless and stuck in this place. Um, and because that felt so scary, I want to avoid that at all costs. And so because I'm avoiding that at all costs, now I'm constantly scanning for that danger.
Mhm.
And so with big T's and little T's, big T's are kind of what you'd expect, right? An assault, war, an accident of some kind. With small T's, I like to think of it as a little bit as like death by 1,000 paper cuts, bullying. It can be childhood neglect. It can be not feeling known or not feeling like a sense of belonging. And so I specialize especially in complex trauma. And what makes complex trauma unique is that it's interpersonal trauma. It's person to person. And
Mhm.
so it could be from friends, it could be from a family unit, but it's relational damage that's occurred from person to person,
Mhm.
where there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of aloneness, there's a lot of feeling stuck and feeling trapped. Um, and usually it's ongoing and repeated time after time. So a lot like being like your needs not being met, having someone that you look up to be very passive aggressive time and time again. Like all of those things are can feel traumatic because it impacts the way we feel about ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. So if I'm understanding correctly, I know there's difference between complex trauma and shock trauma, and it sounds like the big
Mhm.
T's are the shock trauma. If you experience
Yeah.
a car accident, it's this one incident, isolated incident, that's very shocking to your nervous system and reorienting to
Hmm.
your nervous system, where it sounds like the little T's are much more like the complex trauma of like
Hmm.
over a long chronic period of time, multiple traumatic events happening, and it's not like these big things, but it's within a relationship that is like kind of shaping the story that you're telling about yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. And I'm curious, do you work with shock trauma as well? Like the
Mhm.
big T's? Okay. Uh,
Yeah.
From my experience, I'm kind of curious to know about your experience. I've noticed that the complex trauma typically is more painful for people to sit with than
Hmm.
the like shock trauma.
Yes. Because shock trauma, right? Everyone can look at that and be like, "Oh, wow, that's so horrifying." It's obvious
Mm,
to anyone to be able to validate how painful that must have
horrific
been.
it's been. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
But
didn't think
for
about it in
the
like
other
a
thing,
in like the environment reinforcing or like uh, that transaction between the environment and like that person. You're absolutely right. Like the shock trauma, people are probably much more willing to validate it than
hmm
I think that's can be very invalidating because it's like, oh, that's just like how it's supposed to be, or that's your experience as a woman, or that's experiences, buck up, you know,
yeah,
yeah,
that's
get over it.
exactly it, right? Yeah, a lot of it is like, well, you just have to move on, you know? It's being met with a lot of invalidation because people don't see or can't experience and understand what that's like. And so that level of resilience hasn't been there because they haven't been validated. They don't feel known, they don't feel seen. And that I think is another um, really like you see that a lot, that like invalidation of self because they've been invalidated by other people for so long.
Absolutely, which creates a ripple effect, I'm sure, right? Like
Hmm.
where like because that in itself is like uh, traumatic of like
Hmm.
either not being seen, not being heard, not being like like believed. And so I'm sure there's this rippling effect from the events that have already happened, which then lead into more invalidation and more complex trauma being kind of created.
Hmm. Absolutely. And then that spans generations too, right? Like if
Mm,
what we've experienced and what our ancestors have experienced, like when you just kind of go up the line of the things that people have experienced and the way that we either process through it and deal with it and heal from it so that we don't pass it on, or we or they don't, and we're just inheriting kind of all of these behaviors and these ways of being.
mhm. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of studies now being put out there where, yes, I think there's things that we're taught because you're being taught by someone who maybe has not worked through their trauma. And so, like, there's going to be different behaviors and patterns that are being taught to you. And because that's the only way that you know how to navigate the world, because that's your only caregiver. But then there's also, I think, a lot of research coming out of like how trauma alters our DNA, and especially like
Hmm.
how do you know what I'm talking about? Of like the study with
Yeah.
I think it's women and kind of with their eggs, and then like that's passed down, so it impacts like 3 generations or something, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. I know
Okay,
what
okay,
that
okay.
study
I
is.
don't know if you can expand on it, but I'm not an expert in it, but it's crazy about how that intergenerational trauma piece is really important. And I think as in our culture, we really only think about the here and now almost. We don't think about
Mhm.
how our ancestry or the relationship with our grandparents or their grandparents like really impacts kind of what's going on, which I think
Yeah.
we probably should kind of focus more on in therapy, but we really don't. It's kind of not the Western way.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because when you think about even just the last 100 years of what life looked like for our grandparents, our great grandparents, and it looks completely different. There's so much that's changed. And I think it's to be able to account for that and the privilege of what it's like, at least to live here at this moment in history. Not that it's perfect, right? Like
Absolutely.
the what it's like to be a woman, what it's like to be a person of color, what it's like to be somewhat like in the queer community. Like there's
Hmm.
still so much like oppression there. And also to look just in terms of access of generationally of how to be attuned, the level of emotional attunement, what was going on in the environment, what was accessible and what wasn't, but that all matters too, not only like the way that expresses in our genes, but also the way that plays out from person to person.
Hmm. Yeah. When you started sharing that, I thought about the kiddos that I used to work with. Cause like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, there was like Facebook when I was like in high school, but that was it. And now just the way that we relate to the world is so much different and so diverse.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of crazy. Which
Yeah,
brings on this whole new kind of way that we relate to ourselves and relate to the world and how we navigate in the world. And like it's interesting because our biology is not up to speed almost, you know.
truly.
And
Yeah,
I'm very interested to see how like humans will like adapt and navigate, kind of with like how much technology has shifted and changed in our lives, even like in our
yeah,
lifespan, you know.
truly. Like it's, I mean, I'm 30, I'm almost, wait, how old am I? 36, 35. I'm 35. And just thinking about what being a teenager was like for me and, 20 years ago, and which feels like yesterday, but what then being a teenager now and the access to the internet, to the world, to the constant exposure to friends, which before it was just like, oh, if I maybe I saw you on Instant Messenger, but like I don't really know what my friends are doing. Like I didn't even have a cell phone until my freshman year. That just wasn't part of the culture. And
Yeah.
now it's like there's just constant engagement. Like I can't imagine what that's
Hmm.
like to be a teenager right now.
Hmm. I think about like Esther Perel's like kind of her newest work. I think it's pretty new, of like her artificial intimacy type languaging, and like how it's so true of like how we really are craving connection. I think that's the part of complex trauma that is so painful to humans, is that alone piece, the isolation piece of
Mm-hmm.
like the story that we create around it, of like no one else understands, no one knows what I'm kind of going through, it's me. Because like it's all shame based, and like I
Mm-hmm.
think that shame is trauma. And like when there's brain scans
Yes.
looking at like when we have trauma and shame, the same areas of our brain light up, which is crazy and
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. And so we experience shame as trauma, and shame, the emotion, is telling us like we are not consumable for humans. Like we need to like isolate, we need to remove ourselves, and that like
Mm-hmm.
perpetuates the complex trauma, I think. And there's so many ways now that we can be isolated, or we see, people doing things and we're like, oh, that's not me. And like, that comparison piece, which is so painful. And there's so many more ways I think that we can relate and shame ourselves through social media, and which is just kind of creating more complex trauma and more isolation, and more pain for people.
Absolutely. I feel like it's that the shame is what keeps us isolated when we're meant for connection. And there's all of these ways where we're trying to seek connection, but it actually is an artificial, like it's not real, right? Like you can there's so many things on the internet or virtual reality that it's a benefit, but also there's no depth there. And if there's not depth, then are we really known? And if we're not really known, then we still feel really lonely and isolated. And so it's really interesting how it can kind of be this self-fulfilling prophecy of like, I want to be known, but I'm scared to be known. I want to be known, but I'm looking for it in these ways that aren't going to be providing like real depth. Um, and it just kind of kicks that can down the road.
Yeah, I love that languaging that you use around not being known, because it goes back to vulnerability, right? And that's a lot of things,
Mhm.
like thinking about in a relationship, as like a relationship therapist, what makes relationships last is being able to really know your partner, and really know
Mhm.
like how you work and know how they work, know their inner like dreams and desires and all that good stuff. And when we are not known and we're not vulnerable, um, it's isolating. And I'm thinking about it in the way of like complex trauma and the artificial um, intimacy of like so many. When people go through complex trauma, I see this all the time of like, I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be known. But on the other side of it, I really do, but I'm scared of it. I'm terrified of it. And it's this like bind that people are in a lot of like, I really want to be vulnerable, but I can't be. But in order to have like solid relationships, I have to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's so that it's so much distress tolerance. It's so much of learning how to sit in your own discomfort and learning to befriend that fear, befriend that anxiety instead of, because everyone wants to just go away. But that's, it's information. And so if we can treat it as information, and if we can learn to sit with it instead of trying to like, get it away, like exile it and kick it as far away from us as possible, then it's not as scary anymore. Then it's something that you can work with instead of working against. Um, but it is really, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place when a lot of times complex trauma comes from people that were supposed to be, you were supposed to feel safe with, that you're supposed to trust, that you were looking to survive, and that there was like a trust and a safety that wasn't there or that wasn't consistent. And so then trying to establish safety as an adult, to establish trust as an adult with yourself and then with other people in the world, where it's like, okay, I can choose who to trust. I can choose who I feel safe with. I can keep myself safe. I can handle it. Those are really important mountains to climb. But man, it feels good when you get there.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. In NARM, they talk a lot about child consciousness and adult consciousness. And basically, that's what you just described of like, as a
Mm-hmm.
child, our caregiver, and the greatest threat as we have as like humans is to break or um alter the relationship that we have with a caregiver, right? It kind of always goes back to
Mm-hmm.
like that attachment with who raised us. And adult consciousness is this thing of like, we have agency, we have control, we have choices. But as a child, you don't have that. You only have one lifeline, and you have to protect that lifeline at all cost. And when we are raised, and I truly believe that all parents are trying to do the best that they can do,
Agreed.
and we're imperfect humans,
Mm-hmm.
and we may have the best intention as a parent, and we still may miss a tune to our kid, or have these different type of like attachment failures. um but ultimately, we think of our parent as this all-knowing, like unvaluable being, and then that sets the tone of all your relationships in the future, because that's the
Mm-hmm.
foundation of future relationships, right? And I think that's a lot of the work that I do with clients, is this like individuation from your caregiver. And I think that is part of that's real powerful, of being able to be like, yeah, this happened, and now I get to make a choice, rather than like, oh, this happened and this is what's always going to happen to me.
Absolutely. It's this the ability to reparent yourself, the
Yeah.
ability to re-experience of, okay, I can say I can understand, or I can understand where my parents are coming from, and that's where I think that generational piece makes a difference. And I can be an explanation without being an excuse of some of those ruptures. And so now to be able to say, oh, I can, like, the importance of making a repair, the importance of being able to individuate from what was my parents and what was mine. Because as a kid, if we look to our parents to regulate, and if
Mm-hmm.
they're dysregulated, then it must be because we've done something wrong. And so the kid's way of coping with that distress, if they're not being co-regulated with, is self-blame. And so, and that
Mm-hmm.
self-blame just like plants a seed that then just grows and grows and grows as you become an adult, of, oh, there's something wrong with me, or oh, it's my fault, or oh, I should have done something, as opposed to, oh, my parent was really struggling in that moment, and they were responsible for handling their own emotions instead of yelling at me, but there wasn't a repair made. And so
Right.
now to be able to have, conscious parenting, gentle, all these, there's so many different parenting styles that are just mindful, and to be able to treat your kid like a human. Like, hey, I did that. I'm so sorry. Like this was on me. That wasn't having to do with you. And we can make a repair that's so healing as a kid.
Is. And it teaches kids how to make repairs, like as when they get in their own relationships or even repairing with you, because like kids are not perfect, like they're gonna
They're
feel
learning.
shame and like
Yeah.
yeah, and for you're modeling how to do that in a healthy and effective way, which is so powerful
Mhm.
and beneficial to them.
Yeah. Because, yeah, they're learning how to be a human. Well, I'm still learning how to be a human.
Always.
Like that's the thing, is like we're constantly learning, and it's trial by fire, and we mess up and then we make a repair. And that's the difference between guilt and shame, right? Like shame says like, oh, I am bad because of this thing that I did, as opposed to
Mhm.
guilt, which is just like, oh, I acted out of my values. Oh, that didn't feel good. Oops, I made a mistake. And
Mhm.
so to be able to share that with a child, to also, man, how powerful for me and my younger self that didn't have someone teaching me how to do that.
Yeah. And kind of going back to how you relate to it as a child, right? Like if you're a kid and you're really holding on to that attachment with your parent, the safest thing is to be like, oh, well, I am bad, which creates this shame based identity,
Yes.
and that carries on in the future. And it's so powerful to be able to be like, wait, okay. Like in adult consciousness, like, wait, this is these are my flaws. This is kind of what I did. And like, I am a person that makes mistakes rather than I am a mistake.
Hmm.
And that is like, even though those are like very small kind of how do you say that word?
Linguistic.
Yes, linguistic. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Even though it's a small linguistic kind of change, it's so powerful. It really changes the way that we relate to ourselves.
Language matters so much. The way that we say things and the way that connects with how we feel about it makes such a big difference. And so even just that small shift, it creates huge, like just in my body, I can like notice the difference of what that feels like.
Hmm. Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Because it's so interesting because shame like keeps us small and like it wants us to like kind of like curl up, and the opposite of that, the expanded space, is much more like open and powerful. And yeah, it's interesting to notice
Mhm.
those shifts in the body.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the process of EMDR? Because I get a lot of questions about NARM, and it's like
Mhm.
impossible to answer because they're like, what is it? What's like a typical NARM session? And I'm like, well, it kind of based on you and what you're showing up with. And but I'm wondering like, what does a typical EMDR session look like? How's the process? Or is that not really a thing? Like, is it more because like our NARM is much more of like
Yeah.
art form, so it's like kind of shifts and changes where I think other modalities are much more structured, and I think
Mhm.
EMDR is kind of much more structured.
Yeah, EMDR, there's a whole protocol, and there's scripts, and there's, because the language matters, and so there's a consistency of staying with the script to some
Okay.
degree. Um, but it also, it's a little science, it's also a little bit of an art form, and there's different ways of doing it. And so in a typical EMDR session, we start with history taking, we do a lot of resourcing, we kind of talk about what those targets are, what those memories are that we really want to focus on, what the negative beliefs are that we're kind of bringing to the table that we'd like to shift.
Mhm.
Um, but also creating like a future template. Like, what do you want to feel like if in this situation? What is the goal? Like, how would you like to walk into this room, and how would you like to feel? And so history taking and resourcing, so that way, because it can feel kind of intense. So that way, after session, you have skills that you can use to kind of regulate your nervous system if you're feeling activated or triggered. Um, and then once we kind of move into more of the reprocessing area, it's identifying a target. So, what is the memory that we really want to focus on? The one that still feels really activating when we think about it now. And then, what's the negative belief that goes with that target memory? Um, and then the flip of that, like, okay, so this is a negative belief that has kind of a stronghold. What would you like to shift it to in a more positive and adaptive way, right? Like, what's our goal? Um, And then we use a lot of measurements too. So, right. So like, okay, how true does that positive belief feel to you now? And it's attuning to how that feels now, not what we think, because it's easy to overthink and stay in our head, but
Right.
to really like feel it in our heart. Like, okay, how true does that feel to you now? And we kind of use that as a measurement. And then, okay, when you think about that negative belief and that memory, how disturbing does that feel to you now on a scale of 0 to 10? And then also, like, what emotions come up for you? Where do you feel those in your body? And really attuning to like more of like a physical, like sensory experience.
Mm-hmm.
Because once we get into the tapping portion, and either, people have different ways of what they like for bilateral stimulation. Some people like to self tap. Some people like to hold the tappers. And some people like to just follow the eyes, follow the light and use eye movements. And that, stimulates the brain. And so then we sit for about 50 seconds. I'll tell them, okay, hold that memory and hold that negative belief and see where your brain wants to take you. And the beauty of it is that they are in control the whole time, that the tappers kind of keep them grounded into this present moment while they're also kind of just briefly visiting that memory. And they don't have to re-experience all of the details. They don't have to tell me everything. What's really important is that their brain is revisiting that time. And then in 50 seconds, after you kind of explored where your brain wants to take you, we're gonna turn off the tappers. I'm gonna ask you, hey, what did you notice? What's come up? What came up? And they just very briefly explain to me what happened, what came up for them, what they noticed.
Mm-hmm.
And we just keep doing that, over and over. And it's different than talk therapy because I'm not inserting myself. We're not processing through what's happening in those processing sessions. I'm just kind of noticing. I'm like, okay, go with that. It's not my job to interrupt your brain unless it stays it gets stuck. And then at that point, I'll kind of offer some interweaves or some, you know, some comments or feedback or somewhere to go. But for the most part, the brain does the work. It's really powerful.
As you were saying that, it reminded me of like in NARM, we talk about how like the body wants to regulate itself, and we just want
Mm-hmm.
to allow, like, give the body space to do that. And they talk about how like everyone wants growth, like post-traumatic growth, and it's like the body is going to move there, like a plant orients to the sun. The body will do that once you help remove some of the strategies that are at play that keep people stuck. And it sounds like very respectful, like very consensual, like, which is a lot of what happens in complex trauma is like we aren't given consent, or the consent has been
Mm-hmm.
taken away, and we feel like helpless or powerless. And I think like one of the most healing things that we can do with clients is just to be able to be very consensual. Like, this is your space, this is your time. Like, you don't have to do anything that makes you feel uncomfortable,
Yes,
which is so powerful.
absolutely. It's giving the power back to them. And that's such a big part of the healing process. And so with EMDR, I also utilize other modalities like AEDP and parts work and a lot of like somatic parts work. And so it's really just like, hey, you are in charge of your body. You are in charge of this whole experience. All I get to sit, you're allowing me to sit with you and be in this with you.
Yeah.
But if I don't say, if I say something that's not the right fit, if we go to a place that you're not comfortable with, if something's not aligning for you, then please let me know so that we can kind of change course, because this is their experience. And the hope is for them to feel empowered.
One thing I haven't asked you yet that I'm curious about is like, how is EMDR different from exposure therapy? And that's where I was like, when you're talking through it, it reminds me a little bit of exposure therapy. It reminds me a little bit of like cognitive processing therapy. So I'm curious, like, how is, and that's what I've kind of heard EMDR compared to a lot as, is like exposure therapy. It sounds like it's not all exposure therapy, but I'm curious, like, what's the differences between the two?
Yeah. With exposure therapy, it's different from exposure therapy because you're not having to re-experience and relive all the details and then sit with that discomfort and kind of just like move through it and kind of
Okay.
like white knuckle it. With EMDR, your brain is allowing you to go where it needs to go without experience every single detail, and then share with me
Mhm.
every
Mhm.
single detail. Because with EMDR, we start with our target memory, like our anchor point, and it might be that your brain just needs to reprocess the, scene by scene, the different parts of that event. But a lot of times too, it takes us to other parts of that memory network. It could be a totally different memory that pops up that's totally unrelated. That might, a lot of times people are surprised. I'm like, oh wow, I didn't expect my brain to go here, but this is where it needed to move through that
Mhm.
negative belief of, not being good enough or whatever it is. Or this feeling is what's arising, or I'm noticing this feeling in my body. It's not just staying with this one particular memory and reliving it over and over and over again until finally it feels comfortable.
Mhm. Interesting that you said like anger point,
Hmm.
like because that's a lot of what I see with NARM is like this shift between the shame and like kind of because shame is that child consciousness kind of place, and then the anger is like adult consciousness. Like there's a protest for a need with anger, and it's very
Hmm.
interesting because it's very cool to watch clients go through that and being shifting from shame to like anger and be like, wait, yeah, that was unjust. Like that's fucked up.
Yeah.
Like I like deserve something different. I should have been treated in a different way. And like it's
Hmm.
cool to see that like aliveness come online and to like work with rather than like the
Yeah.
inflated shame like kind of
Mm.
contracted place. So it's
Yeah, that freedom, right? Like
yeah.
that freedom to move through the anger, the freedom to move through, and then the sadness, and then um yeah, to be able to have that to like anchor the anger too. you know
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm curious how you see complex trauma impacting people's relationships.
Well, that's a great question. A lot of times it's a feeling of being misunderstood. Again, that feeling of like not being known. And that creates so much sadness and disconnection in a relationship of like, oh, you can't possibly understand. Or they really can't understand because complex trauma is so complex that it doesn't always look like a diagnosis, like it looks like you're just fine, but it's this feeling of sadness, this feeling of like, oh, I just feel trapped and I don't know how to get out of this feeling. And so it can be really difficult for partners to understand
Mhm.
if they don't understand the details of complex trauma.
Yeah, yeah. And the reason why I'm laughing is because I NARM we talk a lot about different survival strategies that come to play. And I really see in relationship work how people have adapted and survived through their complex trauma, like supports the other person's
Yeah.
adaptations to trauma. So it's like we
Hmm.
kind of create this bind within our relationship of like we're supporting each other's kind of survival strategies, which can be really powerful, but also keep us stuck. And
Yes.
it's very interesting because on the outside, someone could look like fine and perfect, but inside they're like, ah, like screaming, like their skin's on fire, but they've adapted and to not show
Yeah.
that. Or we adapt by like attuning to everyone else, but we lose our needs and wants, and we don't, it's very threatening to have needs and wants. And then that comes out, through not being able to communicate properly with your partner. And so that's why I was laughing. It's like very interesting to see how all of those kind of how we don't respond to complex trauma all in the same way, and then we find people who will typically support those survival styles.
Absolutely. And then I feel like to add on to that about the caretaking, this like anxious need to take care of the other person to make sure that they're good so that they don't abandon me, right? So that I can feel safe in this relationship, is that there's still an element of resentment that whether it's acknowledged or not, there's a level of, okay, I'm doing all of this work and I'm taking care of this person, but who's taking care of me? Either I don't feel worthy of being taken care of, or I'm frustrated that no one's taking care of me, that I don't know how to get my needs met or advocate for my own needs in a way that is not defensive, right? Or that's
Mm-hmm.
adaptive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that goes back to where I see in complex trauma is that there's always some sense of self. Like, even though we may have lived through horrific things, we still have that healthy, agency driven adult consciousness sense of self. It's in there
Mhm.
somewhere, but we usually stop honoring it, stop listening to it, detach from it because it just seems threatening. Because that's how we've
Yeah.
had to navigate and survive. which I think is like its own process of like grieving of like, oh, this happened to me and I did this to myself in a way.
Mhm.
And I think that that process of like sitting in that sadness can be very grieving, it can be very powerful, but also just like a really powerful and somewhat painful process too.
Absolutely. Of like recognizing the ability to choose, or like what has happened to me that I didn't choose, but then how I choose to engage with it.
Mm-hmm.
And owning that, which can feel really empowering, but also can feel really daunting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other things that you see in regards to like how complex trauma impacts relationships?
Speaking from like a family system perspective, because a lot of the work that I do is working with trauma, people who have experienced traumatic events or have complex trauma and now are parents, and
Mm,
either they thought they've dealt with it or they didn't even know, they didn't have as much insight, and now their
mm.
kids are holding up a mirror to all of their unresolved stuff,
Uh-huh.
that it's like now all of a sudden really activating in them. And either, oh, I'm reenacting patterns that I experienced that I know I didn't like. And now I don't know how to change that for my child, but I know I don't want to do that anymore.
Mhm.
Or I am really actively trying to parent differently, but I just feel really, this feels really hard. This feels really scary. I'm so sad for my younger self who didn't have a secure caregiver, a consistent, secure caregiver. Um, and so I think I see with complex trauma and just trauma in general, the way that impacts the way we parent, the way that impacts our relationships of all kinds, whether that's our marriage or our relationship with our kids.
Mhm.
And so it can be really activating and really, really rewarding, but also really draining to have to every day, right? Like have this mirror held up. And so I think with that's why I really love EMDRs, because it's a way of engaging with some of these more deeply embedded, more subconscious belief systems that then can kind of untangle that knot. So that way, our nervous system are more consistently regulated so that we can parent more effectively, to be more connected to ourselves, to be more connected to our people.
Mm. Even like in our friendships, I think can hold a mirror up. And that's why I think like relationships are so challenging. Because if we live in isolation, then we can kind of live in like denial or like
Yeah.
like kind of
Yeah.
like this ignorant is bliss, like everything's fine, everything's great. But once we're in a relationship and we start kind of we start getting triggered. And I really have issues with like I know some people are like it's kind of become a joke of like, oh, I'm triggered. Um because and there's a lot of fears around triggering people. And this may seem really harsh, but I think like if you continue living through avoiding triggers, you're never going to do the work and you're never going to get
Exactly.
resolution. And like, at least for me, I think that triggers are invitations of
Yes.
doing the work, and there's something to be explored and not to be avoided. Um, so we go through life and we get triggered, and it's like, great, okay, like another thing that I need to be curious about what's happening for me
Mm-hmm.
so I can operate in the world and not give
Yes.
away my power to whatever the
And
situation is.
I love that so much. And I think the way that you just worded that, it's meeting yourself with such compassion, right? Of like, oh, this thing that feels really triggering, this thing that feels really hard or really scary, usually. And how can I meet myself with compassion to this invitation for growth? It doesn't always feel like that, right? It doesn't feel like an invitation for growth. But
Mm-mm.
anytime that something painful arises, it's like, oh, I can choose to move through it or I can choose to avoid it. And how do I meet myself there with the curiosity and compassion to support myself in this? And I appreciate what you said of like this, the how buzzwordy that like trigger language is, but
Mm-hmm.
also it's an opportunity to build resilience. That it's not something that needs to be avoided or that we need to tiptoe around. And we can be mindful of ourselves. We can be mindful of other people's feelings and experiences and boundaries. And that's so important. And also, to if we know that conflict either within ourselves or in a relationship is an opportunity for growth and an opportunity actually to be more known, to be more understanding, that it doesn't have to be this scary thing that separates us or divides us. um that to be able to meet with that compassion makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's thousands and thousands of dollars. My own therapy work.
Agreed. Same.
I was not like that all the time.
Yeah.
I was probably the most harsh and critical person. I probably still am to myself, but that's been a lot of my own work. So
Yeah. But that's the goal, right?
yeah.
Like to be able to be that attuned, to be able to be that mindful, to be able to be that gentle, like, oh wow, when we feel that inner conflict or that person to person conflict, that this is how I can like see it. This is the way that this is the scaffolding in which I can view it.
Yeah. And that's the gift of therapy. Like that's what I talk to my clients a lot about is like therapy is learning so much about yourself and know how you tick and operate. And that's the greatest gift that you can give yourself because once you know it and you kind of understand it, you can be compassionate. You can also understand like where it's coming from. And then you can also communicate that to other people and say, hey, this is what's happening, rather than having these big emotions or shutting down and then having that kind of rule how you operate in the world. There's no sense of agency, there's no power and control. Where
Yeah.
when you're able to understand, know yourself, be compassionate, then you're able to say like, hey, this is what's coming up for me, here are my parts, here are the things that are, this is how I'm hearing things, this is how this is landing with me. And is that your intention? Is that how you want to be community? Like how, you're able to have a conversation around it.
Yeah.
Which can
Yeah. That like groundedness and self energy is so powerful, as opposed to being like hijacked and kind of blended with these other parts that it's just old stuff, right? Like that's our baggage of either feeling defensive or feeling critical, either of other people or of ourselves, or it's like, oh, that's not like who we really are though, in our like goodness and in our core. Those are just responses or reactions to experiences that we've had.
yeah. So if someone is like really interested about EMDR, working with you, they like your vibe, like where can they find you? Like how can people get connected with you?
Yeah, absolutely. My website, which is just my name, leahgooley.com. You can email me at leah@leahgooley.com. I'm also on social media at Leah Gooley Counseling. And so feel free to reach out, connect with me there too.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was so fun. I always love chatting with you.
Good. I do too. Well, not with me, but
Yeah.
like, with you.
Yeah.
I hope you guys enjoyed the conversation with Leah as much as I did. I learned a lot and I really respect her and all of her work. If you guys are interested in working with me or with Leah, I'm going to post all of our contact information down in the show notes. Or if you are interested in her EMDR intensives, that's also going to be down there as well. If you enjoyed this, liked it, found it helpful, please like, subscribe, share with a friend, because that's only going to keep more content coming your way. As we wrap up today's episode, I just want to leave you with a thought of post-traumatic growth, and that is that there is another side, that their life is possible, a life worth living is possible after trauma. And if you do the work, if you invest in it, if you are bought into doing the work, and I know it's hard and challenging and not super fun, but there is a life worth living on the other side. So I'm just going to leave you with that. And if you need any help, there's resources out there for you guys. Hope you guys stay well. Take care.
I got lost in my own thoughts.
There's so many times where I'll like be going through and I'll be like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'll be like,
thanks for normalizing that.
No, it's
like, where was I going with that?
Yeah, I'm like, oh no.